He thought she was just a waitress. But one sentence turned the entire company against him. The sky was still heavy with clouds when the lights of Falcon Global Enterprises began to flicker on one by one, like sentinels waking for another day of corporate warfare. The 42nd floor, home to the main conference room, seemed cut off from the rest of the world, suspended above the city like a throne of glass and steel. The space was wide, elegant, and silent, its digital screens asleep, waiting for numbers that would decide destinies. Everything there radiated power, from the leather chairs aligned like soldiers ready to obey, to the subtle scent of polished wood that lingered in the air. It was a stage set for the strong to rise and the weak to be crushed. Ethan Ward entered with calculated steps, each movement a reminder of his supremacy. The CEO of Falcon Global carried on his shoulders the reputation of an implacable man, feared by competitors and employees alike. His cold eyes scanned every corner of the room, not out of curiosity but out of an obsessive need for control. He believed a leader only deserved respect when he kept everyone else silent. For Ethan, this meeting was not just about multimillion-dollar deals. It was about reaffirming once again that he was the final voice, the name that could never be challenged. Yet that morning routine carried a figure that didn't fit this setting of power. Clara Evans, in her plain and modest uniform, stepped in carrying a tray of porcelain cups that chimed softly with each step. Her gaze was calm, but within it burned a spark few could perceive. Invisible to the men in suits, Clara observed everything in silence, absorbing the tension that always preceded a meeting. Her job was to serve, and she did it with dignity, though she knew that for most, her presence was nothing more than an insignificant detail. She had no idea that, on this very morning, her silence would turn into a voice, and that her voice would be strong enough to silence the most powerful man on that floor. At Falcon Global, there wasn't a single employee who didn't understand the weight that Ethan Ward's name carried. In the corridors, people spoke of him in hushed tones, as if saying it aloud might draw his unwanted attention. Stories circulated like corporate folklore. Tales of meetings where seasoned executives were humiliated before everyone. Memories of promising young employees who lost all confidence after a single cutting remark. Ethan wasn't just the CEO. He was an almost mythical presence, a shadow that hung over every desk, every report, every decision made beneath him. Wherever he went, the atmosphere bent to his mood, and few dared raise their eyes when he passed. Ethan, for his part, fed on this respect rooted in fear. To him, leadership was not about offering support but about enforcing silence. He believed greatness could only be sustained through strength, and that any sign of kindness was like a crack in glass. Sooner or later, it would shatter. His father had trained him in this cruel logic from a young age. Never be the weak one, never hesitate, never apologize. Each meeting was an invisible battlefield, where victory wasn't measured only in numbers, but in submissive glances. And Ethan made sure to remind everyone that there was room for only one winner. But there was something he himself didn't realize. His iron aura also carried the weight of loneliness. His cold, calculating eyes concealed an unease that few would dare to interpret. Clara Evans, who noticed every detail while discreetly serving the room, saw what others ignored. To her, Ethan's grandeur wasn't just authority, but a mask built out of fear of being seen as fragile. She couldn't put it into words, but Clara sensed that his arrogance was weaker than it looked. It was like a massive wall made of glass, imposing from the outside, but vulnerable to the first precise strike. In the heart of Falcon Global, where multimillion-dollar figures were decided in minutes, Clara Evans occupied a space that went unnoticed by most. Her job was simple: serve coffee and water during meetings that shaped the future of the company. To many, she was just part of the scenery, an invisible detail among digital graphs, glowing screens, and commanding voices. Yet in her simplicity lay a quiet dignity. Clara walked with light steps, balancing the porcelain tray with a natural ease that hid the constant nervousness of being watched, or worse, ridiculed. Her modest uniform, in neutral tones, screamed her difference amidst the expensive suits and polished leather shoes that filled the floor. And still, she moved with serenity, as though she had learned to turn others' indifference into an invisible shield. Clara had grown used to being ignored. She knew that, to the men in suits, she was no more than a reflection in the glass walls, someone whose presence wasn't worth acknowledging. But in that shadow-like condition, she had discovered something rare, the ability to observe. While placing cups, she overheard conversations that would never be spoken in public. While quietly cleaning a table, she noticed glances exchanged that revealed more than pages of reports ever could. Little by little, Clara had become the involuntary guardian of corporate secrets and human truths. She knew who smiled out of convenience, who trembled under power, who hid debts or insecurities behind rehearsed speeches. Her silence was absolute, but her perception was sharp. Perhaps that attentive gaze was what truly made her different from everyone else there. That morning, as she entered the 42nd floor conference room with her tray carefully balanced, Clara felt her heart race. The ritual seemed the same as always. Pour coffee, fill glasses with clear water, smile politely without drawing attention. Yet something in the air was different, almost tangible. The executives avoided meeting each other's eyes, as if a hidden tension was ready to explode. Ethan Ward, seated at the head of the table, radiated a coldness that silenced even the sound of footsteps. Clara knew she had to remain just another shadow that morning, but the feeling persisted, whispering that her role would not end with the last cup served. Deep down, without realizing it, she was already standing at the center of a destiny that would change everything. Clara moved with light, almost choreographed steps, gliding between the chairs as if she were part of the furniture. The faint clinking of cups against saucers was so soft it blended with the hum of the air conditioning. Still, each of her movements was calculated. She couldn't afford to spill even a drop on the piles of reports or the immaculate suits that dominated the room. To the executives, she was a functional presence, nothing more than a background detail in the corporate scenery. But from the head of the table, Ethan Ward didn't see her as a detail. He stared with narrowed eyes, full of disdain. His expression carried the impatience of a man who believed her simple presence diminished the brilliance of the occasion, as if Falcon Global's grandeur had no place for someone so ordinary. Ethan's disdain, however, was not born solely from social or hierarchical differences. It was also the reflection of his constant need to reaffirm his power. He had built an image of absolute perfection, where nothing could stand out or disrupt the carefully controlled stage he designed. And Clara did. Her simplicity was an uncomfortable reminder that there were people within the company who lived by another rhythm, who did not bow to the weight of wealth or the fear of not belonging. That discreet serenity in her face, that natural grace in her movements, felt to Ethan like a veiled affront. Inside him grew the urge to show everyone that even the humblest figure had to bend to his authority. It was as if his pride demanded a spectacle, a moment where he could remind all who truly ruled that glass room. Clara, on the other hand, was not fully aware of the impact she was having. She continued her work with dedication, balancing the tray steadily, distributing drinks without letting her nerves show. Yet something inside her felt different. The atmosphere seemed heavier with every step, as though she was carrying not just cups of coffee, but also the weight of the judgments cast upon her. Each time she dared lift her eyes, she met Ethan's rigid stare, and it made her heart race in silence. It wasn't exactly fear, but a strange sensation, as if she sensed that his gaze was not just reproach, but a warning. Clara couldn't explain it, but she intuited that this moment, seemingly trivial, would become the starting point of something that could change not only her routine, but perhaps the fate of the entire room. The low murmur at the start of the meeting dissolved like foam on still water as Ethan Ward settled into the head chair. The scraping of seats ceased, the rustling of reports went quiet, and even nervous coughs were swallowed by the heavy air dominating the 42nd floor. Outside, the city pulsed with its frantic rhythm, but inside, time seemed suspended. The silence was not natural. It was imposed, and everyone knew it. There was something almost ritualistic in the way the room hushed the moment Ethan assumed control, as if his very presence dictated invisible rules all were forced to obey. Clara Evans, still standing, holding the tray close to her chest, noticed every detail of this transformation. A once lively room now turned prisoner to a single man. Ethan felt himself at the center of a theater whose script only he knew. For the CEO, that absolute silence was an invisible throne, a space where his authority grew without him needing to utter a single word. He let the weight of waiting crush those present, studying how each reacted to the tension. Some directors fiddled with their tablets, pretending to analyze data. Others adjusted their ties in repetitive gestures, trying to mask discomfort. But to Ethan, these tiny signs were nourishment. He prided himself on detecting weaknesses hidden in banal movements. His cold gaze swept across faces like sharpened blades, and with every second he maintained the silence, his conviction of dominance grew stronger. The room was his, and every restrained breath confirmed it. But Clara perceived that suffocating atmosphere differently. For her, silence was not only fear, it was revelation. She watched men and women who, outside those walls, were respected leaders, reduced inside to submissive shadows, unable to hold their gaze for more than a few seconds. It made her reflect on how power could distort human nature, turning brilliant professionals into hesitant figures before a single man. The weight of the moment surrounded her, but it did not crush her. Instead of feeling smaller, she sensed something was deeply wrong in that dynamic. As she quietly collected an empty cup, she thought to herself that no silence should ever wield such power over so many voices. She had no idea that soon her own voice, until then invisible, would be the one to shatter that oppressive silence, and at a moment no one would dare predict. The silence dominating the room was abruptly broken when Ethan Ward finally chose to make his first move. His eyes, which had been scanning reports and nervous faces, locked on to Clara Evans, who was quietly picking up cups and refilling glasses of water. Out of all the executives present, it was as if he had chosen the most vulnerable figure to reaffirm his control. His voice rang out firmly, laced with sarcasm, projected so no one could miss it. "Tell me, young lady, how much do you make carrying trays around here? I bet it isn't even enough to buy the tie I'm wearing." A muffled laugh escaped from the back of the room, followed by complicit glances exchanged between two directors. This was not merely a provocation. It was a cruel performance. Ethan wanted to turn Clara's fragility into a spectacle, and the audience was already seated to watch. Clara's heart pounded instantly, as though she had been shoved under a spotlight on a stage she never asked for. Her hands, steady and skilled only moments earlier, now felt heavy, clumsy, as if the tray were made of lead. Heat flushed to her face, burning her cheeks, betraying the shame she tried to suppress. She lifted her eyes for a brief moment and met his, cold, calculating, with the faint smile of someone who took pleasure in reducing another person in front of an audience. It wasn't the first time she had seen such a look. Not in that company, nor in her life. But this morning, before that silent row of executives, Clara felt something was different. The humiliation she endured was not just another. It was the spark of something greater, as though an invisible thread inside her was about to snap. The executives, visibly uneasy, averted their eyes, but their complicit silence was crueler than any laugh. Each of them knew they could easily be the next target, and that fear kept them motionless, content to remain spectators. For Clara, that indifference cut as deep as Ethan's words. It was as if their silence confirmed her worth was truly lesser. Yet beneath her shame, something else began to burn. It was not just embarrassment, but a stubborn spark of dignity that refused to be extinguished. She knew that if she stayed silent now, this moment would repeat itself forever, not only for her, but for anyone marked by simplicity. And without realizing it, her gaze began to lift, no longer timid, but defiant. The first crack in Ethan's wall of silence had begun to form. Ethan Ward's words reverberated inside Clara like an unending thunderclap. The flush on her face deepened with each second, and the heat burned her cheeks as though she were under invisible spotlights. The tray in her hands, once light, had become an unbearable burden, each cup feeling multiplied in weight by her shame. The sensation of being watched suffocated her, even when most pretended not to look. Every step that followed felt unsteady, and for a fleeting moment the thought of dropping everything and running away seized her mind. But something inside her, a stubborn sense of dignity, refused to give in. She knew that if she did, she would give Ethan exactly what he wanted, to turn her into a spectacle of inferiority before them all. Clara tried to convince herself to accept it as part of her routine. It wasn't the first time she had been ignored, nor the first time someone had tried to diminish her. Yet in that moment, something was different. Memories of every time her voice had been silenced rushed through her mind. Sleepless nights without recognition, disdainful looks that followed her like shadows, doors closed simply because she lacked the right name. Each memory piled upon her shame, but instead of breaking her, they fueled a fire within. The shame, paradoxically, transformed into indignation, and that indignation, still small, began to shape into unexpected courage. It was as though, in the face of humiliation, her very soul was being challenged to rise. The executives at the table could feel the tension, even as they pretended to be absorbed in reports and glowing screens before them. Some fiddled with their pens, others forced nervous smiles, as though unwilling to admit they were witnessing something far too uncomfortable. Yet everyone sensed there was something different in the air. The silence that had once symbolized Ethan's authority now felt heavy, complicit, no longer the same. Clara, though motionless for a few seconds, was no longer the same either. She held the tray steady in her hands, but her heart pounded like a drum announcing change. She didn't yet have the words ready, but deep inside she knew she wouldn't stay silent forever. And when she finally spoke, that glass hall would never be the same again. The silence in the room carried almost physical weight, as if the air itself were denser and harder to breathe. Each executive, seated in their leather chairs, tried to mask the tension in different ways, but all shared the same fear, becoming Ethan Ward's next target. Some buried themselves in reports they had read countless times, feigning concentration to avoid the discomfort. Others tapped their pens nervously against blank pages, merely to keep their trembling hands occupied. There were also those who, despite keeping their eyes down, couldn't help but sneak quick glances at Clara, as though secretly sharing in her embarrassment. Yet not one dared to break the silence. None had the courage to confront the figure who reigned at the head of the table. Many had witnessed similar scenes before. It was common for Ethan to single out the most vulnerable person to reassert his authority, and this practice had become almost a perverse ritual within Falcon Global. But that morning something felt different. The way Clara Evans, though exposed, remained firm with the tray in her hands, did not go unnoticed. She didn't lower her eyes as expected, nor did she shrink before the CEO's cutting words. That silent resistance, almost imperceptible, created a new kind of tension in the air. It was like watching a rope stretch to its limit. Everyone knew that if it snapped, the consequences would be unpredictable. The contrast between Ethan's disdain and Clara's quiet dignity stirred an uncomfortable feeling in every spectator, that they were about to witness something far from ordinary. Clara, though struggling to hide the tremor threatening her hands, noticed the glances around her clearly. Some were filled with pity, others with pure indifference, and a few even showed a strange relief that they weren't the ones being targeted. But beneath it all, she saw a collective, suffocated desire. That someone would finally do what none of them had the courage to do: challenge Ethan. The realization struck her like a revelation. Her humiliation was not merely personal. It was the reflection of an entire company enslaved by fear. Suddenly, the silence that once shamed her began to sound like a calling. Her heart beat quickly, but not only from embarrassment. A new energy coursed through her veins, an almost irresistible invitation to become the voice that would echo where so many had remained silent. The brief silence might have been enough to close the incident, but Ethan Ward was not a man to let an opportunity slip away. He leaned back slightly in his leather chair, resting his elbows on the table, and fixed his gaze on Clara Evans like a predator sizing up its prey before the final strike. The crooked smile on his face betrayed the pleasure he took in prolonging the humiliation, in stretching the rope to its breaking point. With the entire room watching, his voice rose again, dripping with irony and calculated venom. "Tell us, Clara, does anyone here really care what you think? You're nothing but a waitress. You should be proud to serve people as important as us." His words dropped like stones into the silence, echoing against the glass walls and further underlining the inequality he wanted to flaunt. The reaction was immediate. Several executives shifted uneasily in their seats, unable to conceal their discomfort. A younger director cleared his throat nervously, as if to protest, but quickly retreated under Ethan's sharp glare. The atmosphere, already tense, grew suffocating. There was no escape for Clara, and everyone knew it. The cruelty lay in the fact that his provocation sought no logical reply. It was a direct assault on her dignity, meant to crush any trace of resistance. A muffled chuckle from an employee at the far end of the table sliced through the tension, making it clear that, even in discomfort, some preferred to side with the boss's power rather than risk defying him. The spectacle was staged, and Ethan thrived on the fear he himself cultivated. Clara, meanwhile, felt her heart pound harder. The words did not just attack her job. They cut into her very essence, reducing her to nothing before them all. For a moment, she considered swallowing the insult in silence, as she had so many times before. But when she looked around, she noticed something different. Everyone was waiting for her reaction. It was no longer just about her. It was a symbolic battle. Her eyes locked onto Ethan's once again, and instead of lowering her head, she held firm, meeting his cold, arrogant gaze. Deep inside, she knew she was about to cross an invisible line, and in doing so, she would change not only the perception in that room, but perhaps the entire story of Falcon Global. Ethan Ward's words still lingered in the air, clinging to the room like smoke that refused to dissipate. It was the kind of remark meant to be received with silence and submission. But before him now stood Clara Evans, her whole body trembling between the urge to shrink and the will to resist. Her breath came fast, her heartbeat hammered in her chest, but instead of retreating, she stood her ground. The weight of the tray in her hands no longer represented mere work. It had become an improvised shield against the contempt aimed at her. Clara knew she was at the center of an invisible stage, and the suited audience waited to see what she would do. And in that moment, she understood. Either she remained invisible as always, or she chose, once and for all, to be seen. Memories of her life flashed through her like lightning. Nights of working double shifts without recognition. The whispers of disdain she had pretended not to hear. The tears she hid when she returned home exhausted. She remembered her mother's weary eyes, always reminding her that dignity had no price, and her younger sister's shy smile, seeing her as a silent example of strength. Each memory was fuel. Each unhealed wound pulsed as a reason not to stay quiet. Clara realized that this moment was not only about her, but about everything she had carried in silence for so long. If she accepted the humiliation, she would be denying not just her own voice, but her entire story. The executives watched in absolute suspense. No report, no chart on their tablets could distract them from the scene unfolding before their eyes. Some bit their lips, others squeezed pens between their fingers, all tense, as if they sensed they were on the brink of witnessing something unprecedented. The silence that had always been Ethan's weapon now seemed to have changed owners. Now it was Clara who commanded the expectation, solely with her gaze. She lifted her eyes slowly, fixing them on the CEO with unexpected firmness. She no longer saw the untouchable man everyone feared, but someone hiding fragility behind a mask of power. For the first time, Clara understood she didn't need to fear him. She only needed to speak. And deep down, she knew her words would not just be a response. They would be a rupture. Clara Evans's heart felt as though it might leap out of her chest. But in the midst of the storm, something unexpected began to rise within her. A steady calm. A rare clarity that only appears when one decides not to back down anymore. The fear was still there, pulsing beneath her skin, but it no longer paralyzed her. On the contrary, it became fuel for a courage that even surprised herself. Her eyes, long accustomed to lowering before arrogance, lifted firmly toward the man everyone feared. The tray, once the symbol of her subordinate role, now seemed irrelevant beside the upright posture she assumed. For the first time in a long while, Clara did not feel invisible. She felt whole. Ethan Ward, seeing that look, experienced a sensation unfamiliar to him: discomfort. He was not facing suppressed tears or a figure shrinking under the weight of shame, as he had so many times before. What he saw was a silent resistance, almost defiance, that seemed to shatter the very logic of the hierarchy he believed unbreakable. He tried to maintain the smirk of contempt he always wore as a weapon, but something inside him faltered. How could a simple employee, someone he deemed insignificant, dare look at him as an equal? Even the smallest seed of doubt corroded the steel mask Ethan always displayed, and that detail, nearly imperceptible, was noticed by everyone around the table. The executives, who had sat motionless in their chairs until then, now felt they were witnesses to something extraordinary. The absolute silence no longer carried the same nature as before. It was no longer the silence of fear imposed by Ethan, but of expectation before the woman rising against him. Some felt ashamed of themselves for never having found the courage to do what Clara was doing at that moment. Others, though afraid of the reaction that might follow, could not help but admire her boldness. The glass-walled room seemed electrified, as if every molecule of air vibrated in suspense. And at the center of it all, Clara stood tall, locking eyes with Ethan with a determination no one had ever imagined possible in someone like her. The silence in the room was so dense that any sound felt like an explosion. Clara Evans's heart was racing, but her gaze stayed firm, locked on Ethan Ward. It was the moment to break through the barrier that had kept her invisible. Without a tremor in her voice, the words flowed naturally, as if they had always been waiting for the right moment to emerge. Funny, Everyone here knows what's in your pocket. But do they know what's in your heart? The phrase, simple yet sharp, echoed through the room like an unexpected thunderclap. It was as though Clara had wielded an invisible blade to cut straight through the aura of power Ethan had so carefully cultivated. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning grew audible, as though the entire world was holding its breath for his reaction. For several seconds, no one moved. The air itself seemed suspended, as if even the city outside had paused to listen. The executives, who moments earlier avoided looking at her, could no longer tear their eyes away from Clara. There was something magnetic in her courage, something that held everyone captive to that one sentence. Ethan, caught off guard, could not respond immediately. The rehearsed confidence of his smile fractured, revealing a crack in his mask. For the first time in years, he had no ready words to crush someone. The blow wasn't about money, or titles, or positions. It was about something no wealth could ever buy: character. And in that instant, even the most skeptical among them felt an undeniable truth. Power does not lie in position, but in the courage to expose what truly matters. Clara stood tall, unflinching, and in that simple gesture radiated a greatness that overflowed into everyone present. The silence around her was no longer one of humiliation, but of admiration. Some executives held their breath. Others felt their chests swell with an unfamiliar hope. It was as if, in that moment, they all understood that strength was not only in the head seat, but could also emerge from the dignity of someone brave enough to speak the truth. And no matter how much Ethan tried to recover his composure, there was no undoing the impact. The waitress he had tried to belittle had just turned the entire room into the stage of his greatest moral defeat. A single gaze, paired with one piercing sentence, had accomplished what no report, no negotiation, and no director had ever dared to achieve: silence the most powerful man at Falcon Global. The effect of Clara Evans's words spread like an invisible wave through the room, striking each person differently. Some executives widened their eyes, stunned by her audacity. Others held their breath, as if the slightest movement would shatter the historic moment unfolding. The silence, once owned by Ethan's fear, now belonged to Clara. Her voice, firm and unexpected, echoed against the glass walls as a reminder that even the simplest person could shake the iron heart of Falcon Global. It was unthinkable only minutes before, but now etched into memory as a definitive rupture. Time seemed to stop, and the company itself seemed to shrink into that room where an inconvenient truth had just been revealed. Even the distant city sounds, horns, sirens, engines, seemed powerless compared to the force of the words still hanging in the air. Ethan Ward, long accustomed to dictating the pace of every meeting, was the one who felt the blow most sharply. He tried to compose himself, adjusted his tie, but his fingers trembled slightly, betraying the insecurity he fought to conceal. His eyes searched the table for support but found none of the usual submission. Instead, he met tense faces, but also attentive ones, as though they were finally ready to see his fragility. The untouchable mask was beginning to crack, and Ethan knew that if he overreacted, he would only confirm the power of Clara's words. For the first time in years, he was cornered in his own arena, unable to wield the weapons that had always kept him in control. And that enraged him all the more, even as he tried to disguise it with a cold expression. Power, for the first time, seemed to be slipping from his grasp, not through numbers, but through something he had never mastered: genuine respect. Clara, in contrast, stood firm, the tray pressed lightly against her body as if it were part of her armor. Her eyes did not waver, even under the crushing tension that filled the room. Inside, she felt a mixture of fear and relief. Fear of the consequences that would surely come, but relief that she had finally given voice to what everyone else had buried in silence. She couldn't predict what would happen next, but she already understood something had changed forever. Respect was not born from titles or figures, but from the courage to say what needed to be said. And in that instant, Clara was no longer just a support worker. She had become the woman who dared confront the most powerful man at Falcon Global, and won. And though no one dared to applaud openly, the glimmer in the eyes of some colleagues told her plainly, she was no longer alone. The absolute silence following Clara Evans's reply seemed endless, but soon it was broken by restless glances darting across the table. Some executives, unable to mask it, lowered their eyes in shame, as if embarrassed they had never dared to speak the truth she had just voiced. Others, however, kept their eyes fixed on her, filled with admiration for the courage they were witnessing. For a brief instant, it was clear to everyone that her words were not spoken only to Ethan Ward, but to them as well, a reminder that no one should live enslaved by fear. The glass room, once dominated by the weight of authority, was now charged with a new energy, a blend of awe and respect. Power had shifted hands, and everyone knew it, even if none dared admit it aloud. Ethan struggled to regain his composure, but he could not reclaim the control he had lost. His eyes drifted around the table, searching for signs of support, but found only tense faces and complicit silences. The discomfort spread like a ripple, revealing that deep down, many agreed with Clara, even if they lacked the courage to applaud her in that moment. He tried to force a contemptuous smile, but the expression broke halfway, almost artificial, unable to mask the crack that had opened in his image of an unshakable man. It gnawed at him inside, because he knew that the respect he had always demanded through fear was now tainted by doubt. If someone so simple had been able to face him, how far might the courage of others go? The wall of silence that had sustained his authority now showed visible cracks. Clara remained standing, serene, showing no arrogant triumph or need to assert herself further. Her strength lay precisely in her simplicity. She had not sought applause, she had simply said what needed to be said. And paradoxically, that humility made her even greater in the eyes of those present. An older director dared a subtle nod of approval with his eyes, while a young executive allowed a faint smile of admiration to escape. Small gestures, discreet, yet enough to show that the room no longer belonged to Ethan alone. What had begun as just another meeting had transformed into a silent milestone, a memory that each of them would carry forever. They all knew they had witnessed something larger than numbers or reports. They had just watched the symbolic fall of the most feared man at Falcon Global. The room itself seemed to shrink around Ethan Ward, as though the glass walls reflected not only his image but also the fragility he was trying to conceal. He adjusted his tie, ran a hand through his hair, but nothing could hide the unease etched into every gesture. The CEO, who only minutes earlier had dominated the atmosphere with his severe gaze, now found himself exposed before his own audience. His eyes scanned the table for the usual submission but saw only tense expressions, averted glances, or discreet signs of support for Clara. The pride he had always worn like armor was beginning to collapse, and the harder he tried to recover, the more obvious the fissure in his authority became. It was like a house of cards, grand at first glance, but vulnerable to the slightest breath of truth. The silence of those present was no longer the silence of fear, but of judgment. Every second Ethan sat immobile, without reply, deepened the sense that he had lost control. His mind searched for sharp words to reclaim dominance, but none came. Clara's strength had been her simplicity, a truth impossible to refute. And the longer he hesitated, the more the executives realized that the myth of the invincible man was crumbling before their eyes. For Ethan, this realization was unbearable. He had built his entire career on the belief that he could never be questioned, and yet here, in the very heart of the company that bore his name, he was being cornered by a support worker. The irony of the scene was too cruel to endure. Clara, meanwhile, stood firm without needing to say another word. Her silence now carried more weight than any speech. Every measured breath, every unwavering look reinforced her position, and paradoxically, the calmer she appeared, the weaker Ethan seemed. The executives began to see the scene with clarity. This was not merely a waitress standing against a CEO, but a living symbol that dignity can rise even in the face of the most arrogant power. Ethan's pride was slowly collapsing before them all, and there was no turning back. There, on the 42nd floor of Falcon Global, a truth echoed undeniably. Respect is never born from fear, but from courage. That moment at Falcon Global would never be forgotten. The conference hall, once a stage for cold, ruthless decisions, had become the setting for something far greater: the victory of dignity over arrogance. Clara Evans, still holding the tray against her body, needed no grand speech or applause to confirm what she had achieved. Respect surrounded her like an invisible mantle, and everyone in the room felt it. What had begun as an ordinary morning had become a turning point, a moment that redefined not only how they saw her, but what true strength meant within the company. Every glance directed at Clara carried a mix of surprise, respect, and even gratitude. The scene unfolded in slow motion, engraving itself into the collective memory as an eternal reminder that the powerful do not always win. Ethan Ward, meanwhile, remained seated, immobilized by his own silence. His expression still tried to project control, but the emptiness in his eyes revealed the moral defeat he had suffered. For the first time in years, he was no longer the one dictating the rules. No figures, reports, or strategies could undo what had just happened. The executives, once subdued by fear, now understood that his authority was not indestructible. It ate at Ethan inside, because he knew that each second of hesitation was etched in their memories. The man who had always sought to impose respect through fear had been silenced by the courage of a simple employee, and that changed everything. His empire of intimidation was crumbling under the gaze of people who, for the first time, no longer trembled but confronted him in silence. Clara sought no recognition, but she left with something greater than any promotion or praise: the certainty that her voice mattered. As she calmly collected the last cup from the table, she stood tall, her posture speaking louder than any words. The executives watched her, fully aware they had witnessed a rare act of courage, a reminder that power does not lie in the pocket, but in the heart. And in that instant, each of them carried away an indelible lesson: never underestimate those who appear small, for it is often from simplicity that true greatness emerges. When Clara left the room, there was no applause ringing out, but the weight of her courage echoed in every corner of the building. And in their hearts, even the most skeptical knew they had witnessed something that would forever change the way they saw power and dignity. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video, and of course, leave your like. It helps us a lot to keep bringing you emotional stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support.